Hello and welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for June 16th, 2025. My name is Tom Luongo. We have a lot to talk about. I have with me, we are not going to talk about what's going on in Israel and Iran right now, because that is not what's important, because that is not the bailiwick nor the expertise of my good friend and returning guest of the podcast, Dave Bradley. Dave, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I, I'm not, like breathing in and out, hoping that World War III isn't around the corner. So I'm going to go back to eating beef and not you know eating ice cream. Let's just put it that way, because I I think we're I think we're I don't know if we're out of the well, certainly we're not out of the woods, but I don't know. So with that in mind, what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a postmortem. So for people who don't know this, Dave was up at Cornerstone with myself and Alex Craner and others, put on by Sean Newman, and Dave and I spent a lot of time together, having a having the odd, vaguely illicit cigar, and a couple of whiskeys and a steak or two, and it was all really good. And we had a great time, and we talked about a lot of things vis-a-vis Alberta. And with the G7 kicking off today, I thought, what a better time than now to let's kind of do a postmortem on what we saw and we felt when we were up in Calgary together. So, I don't know where you want to start with that, Dave, but that's the open-ended question. I think we should start there.
Yeah, I think the interesting place to start is what you mentioned is what we saw and what we felt.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a really dramatic change. There's been a shift in the Overton window since this latest election here in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us here in Alberta were kind of on the fence in terms of what result we wanted, because it was like, if Pierre gets in, he's going to immeasurably improve everyone's lives pretty much right away, including ours here in Alberta. But that fixing a lot of those problems caused by the Liberals over the last decade would probably have made the prospect of Alberta independence seem less important to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And now with the Liberal win, it's actually pushed people in the other direction even more than I thought. And frankly, the normies have had enough. The average middle of the road, center right voter that we have here in even in downtown Calgary, generally have had enough of this just generally bad deal that
Mm-hmm.
we've been getting for a long time from the federal government. And that, I think you probably saw, was reflected in the energy and the tone at the Cornerstone Forum there.
We it was funny. I'm not. I think I mentioned it to you before I left, or before I left Calgary and went on my little bit of a vacation. But it was the thing that really blew both myself and Dexter White away. We were floored by the level of response, and I even wrote about it a little bit in last month's newsletter for my postmortem on Calgary, where we said we took a correct me if I'm wrong about this, but we kind of had the takeaway that we in America still believe our system is kind of salvageable on a certain level, that there's a certain kind of naivete that we can fix this or whatever, for whatever this is, very large values of this. But Albertans have our system's not salvageable. And that's the impression we got. And we were quite taken aback by it in a good way. And it was just really cool. From that perspective, I mean, let's take that one step further, right? Let's now, what kind of concrete action do you think is on the table now?
Yeah, and I think that's the part that is interesting, is the concrete action became a lot more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Just days after the election, our Premier Daniel Smith, the equivalent of our governor, passed a law or tabled a law making it much easier for citizens to force a referendum on any topic of their choosing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it basically changed that threshold from needing to get 600,000 in-person signatures in 90 days down to a number of 177,000 in 120 days. And so in a province of 5 million people, that's a really meaningful change.
It
And
is.
now it looks very, very likely, in fact, that the first group going for a referendum will be able to succeed in forcing that referendum. And then, the question from there, basically, because right now, this, you can never really believe much from polls, but the polls are generally saying that it's polling in the high 40%, 46, 47% in favor of Alberta independence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's particularly incredible in my mind because of the fact that there isn't really a leader. There isn't really like a coherent movement that you can say that everyone's behind. And that gets us into the range where we had the Quebec question years ago floating in that 49, 51% in either direction for a long time. I
Mm-hmm.
think we're actually in a scenario where we may be able to get a much more significant majority.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, it just really comes down to the math. There's some just indisputable math that will leave the average Albertan much better off
Right.
the first day that we're no longer part of Canada. And I've done some research on this myself, um, very rudimentary chat GBT research, and I'd love to see somebody else do a more credible study on this. But
Sure.
basically, a couple hours digging, and I took the idea that if the provincial government of Alberta was going to deliver all of the services to Albertans that the current federal government does, delivering the same services at the same cost, which I think is a very low bar. We should be able
Mm-hmm.
to do a better job than the ridiculous looting and mismanagement that they're doing now. But even if we are only able to do the same as them, and we were to remove, all the external costs to Alberta, external meaning monies that ultimately get collected in Alberta and distributed to the rest of the country, the average Albertan on day one would save somewhere between $17,000 and $25,000 a year in taxes.
Wow.
And that's the kind of thing that you can't really ignore.
Right.
It's the kind of thing where in the midst of a cost of living crisis, how many people need that $17,000 to $25,000 a year? And the answer is all of them,
Yeah,
right?
no,
So
it's real. That's a significant amount of money, and even if your numbers are off by 20%, right? Even if
yeah,
they're overestimated by 20%, it's still a lot of money. And I don't know what the median household salary is in Canada at this point, but it's not 200,000. Yeah, it's a significant portion of their monthly income, and then, but more importantly, it's an enormous percentage of their disposable monthly income, which is the money that's left over at the end after basic necessities. And that's the money that would go towards real infrastructure. It would one of the things that stuck with me when we were talking about this, we were walking from dinner one night downtown Calgary, and he was like, "This is a Saturday." A Saturday night, and it's not bad, but it wasn't. You noted that it used to be that way every night of the week. It didn't matter what night of the week it was. Downtown Calgary was filled, and now it's only one, maybe 2 days a week at best.
yeah. All that money that would be back in the pockets of Albertans is money that would be spent at Alberta businesses and that would be reinvested in the province of Alberta. It's what people would use to grow and start their own businesses. And really, the compounding effect on the economy of the fact that we've otherwise been giving that money away is just
Mm-hmm.
massive. And you can see that in our downtown. You can see that in our cities because, we've still got a tremendous amount of oil and gas wealth here. The economy is still like we're far from being in a recession. We're still doing well, but it's a shadow of what it was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're in this spot where big capital is afraid to invest, right? Nobody wants to put a multi-billion dollar oil sands project together because the fact is the federal government might just shut it down. You might lose your investment.
Right.
And, we've been in this state of both being looted and stifled at the same time for far too long. And we're really just sort of coasting sideways as an economy at this point. And I think it's really gotten to the point where so many people here feel that
Mm-hmm.
and really have started to feel with this last election, especially that we're not being represented. And it's taxation without representation is basically what we're facing right now. And I don't think people are very happy about that.
It's a very American thing of you to say, and I do love hearing it from one of my brothers north of the 49th parallel. Now, the interesting part about this is funny. One of the theories that's been going around um, the conservative magotard space, whatever you want to call it, since Trump's election has been, if Trump didn't lose in 2020 and then return in 2024, there wouldn't be the same energy for change that we have today. We would have just limped along in a sense. And I get the feeling that you're thinking along those same lines in with the way Albertans are feeling right now, that we have to have this, like, so the election of Carney in a sense is your Joe Biden moment, right? Where, how did these people win again, and how is we have to do something in terms of creating substantive change. And this is a like a lesson for the rest, not just for Canadians or Americans, but for anybody. We're seeing this all replicated around the West. This is a message for everyone around the West, that at some point, the boiled frogs are like, that's enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
And
that's it.
yeah, one thing, back to something we talked about while you were here, that I
Hmm.
think is very interesting, is this group we refer to as they, the global elites, the Davosians, the City of London, etc., whoever they may be, for a very long time they've sort of been directing, most of the world
Hmm.
through kind of like backroom string pulling, right? And they've, it seemed, had a really good idea of how far they can push us,
Hmm.
and that seemingly went out the window in really right around 2019, right? It seemed like the climate hoax was not really getting the legs that they wanted it to have. And I mentioned my own homegrown conspiracy theory, which is where they crossed the Rubicon, was the straws, right? The paper
Oh,
versus the
right.
plastic straws, right? You have this, all of a sudden, this 5-year-old video of a turtle with a straw stuck up its nose goes viral, and then within 2 weeks, every bar and restaurant in the world has somehow switched to paper straws.
Right.
And it's suspicious, first of all, that they had millions, hundreds of millions of paper straws lined up in supply chain infrastructure, ready to get to every bar and restaurant in the world. But it's also quite obvious to pretty much anybody who's used paper or straws that you cannot make straws out of paper. And they they really just, they pushed that too far, and they misjudged that. They misread it, right? They're like, okay, well, we've got everybody sucking up chunks of paper through their cocktails, and they bought it. Their virtue signaling is taking precedence over their own comfort. And
Right.
so, time to roll out stage two. We go with the Chinese virus, basically, right?
Right.
And COVID was the much more meaningful example of where they pushed us too far, right? They really crossed a lot of lines for a lot of people around the world. And the result is that a massively larger number of people in the Western world don't trust their narratives, don't trust the mainstream media, don't trust the science, so to speak.
Mhm.
And that's left us in a spot where we're ready for things like Alberta independence. And I think we're probably going to be just one of the first of many in the Western world that goes for an independence movement, because the fact is we've got 4 or 5 levels of government right now, and the top three are pretty much just leeching off of us without providing us any value. So it'd be great to go to one or two.
Yeah, no, I think that I remember when you now that you mentioned it, you remember you talking about that, and I was like, at first, and you had that kind of, if Dave, he has that smirk that he puts on his face, like, I've got one for you now, Tom. I'm gonna make you, I'm gonna tweak you a little bit. I'm like, okay, and he's like, boom, paper straws. I'm like, oh, I see it. You're right. Like, it's funny when you put it that way, um how you're right. Like, it, the idea that they had this, that this sprang up, like, as like Gimli said in Lord of the Rings, sprang up out of holes in the ground, right? That we not now, which I do a terrible Scottish accent, but it's that whole idea about, there are no dwarf women. They spring out of holes in the ground. Like, well, this is what they do. They create something out of nothing, and then, but immediately they have the solution for you. We're going to hand you this new thing. And yes, they did this with the paper straws. They've done it with a lot of other things. And then COVID, it's amazing how they had all the stupid plastic shields for every CVS in the world, and every convenience store. They had the little they had the infrastructure for these are the 6 foot lines, and where to put your feet on the ground, just like they do at the freaking airport. Like, it's all the same infrastructure, and like, it's the same thing. And like, dude, like, it's a psyop. Like, they were always planning to do this to us, and they had these plans in place, and they just pull it off the shelf. And but they, this is, when you say it that way, this is why I've always, contended, or I started to contend about 3 or 4 years ago, that they have this big Gantt chart and Microsoft project file over at Evil Corp Central. And they just, like, we're rolling this one out on this date and this one out on this date. And we're doing this one here and doing that one there. And it does not matter what we say or what we want. And they have it all, like, game planned out. And okay, well, we have to roll this campaign out here, and then we let it go on this date. And this is the way our opponents are going to react. So we're going to react like this. And the funny part is I just don't think that what's funny now. And you can, I'll turn it back over in just a second to say, I think that they're still running their Gantt chart, but they're not getting the same juice that they ever had before. And what that means is, of course, that they have to continue to escalate or pull things forward in time that they would have wanted to pull off the shelf and say 2022 or 2024. They wanted to give us COVID. Now they had to pull it forward. And they still had the infrastructure in place, but then they had to roll it out sloppily.
Yeah, they're not succeeding the way that they once were. They are still having success, right? And that, as you mentioned earlier, you're saying like I'm praying that Trump is a man of his word, and I think we probably both think that he's attempting to do what he says he's doing, but he's not winning every single battle in this war, obviously, right? And
right.
I think the momentum has shifted though, right? And like I said, with COVID, so many people have now woken up, and the advent of this sort of like alternative media where people can just spread these kinds of ideas has really just, exploded in the last couple of years, since they've really just like took it too far with the whole sort of 1984 thing of like, we know they're lying, and they know that we know that they're lying, but they continue to lie. And they just the lies that they attempted to get through with that method were increasingly absurd, with Biden being right near the top of the list. And
right.
we're seeing more of it now with just the very, very transparent attempt to pull the United States into the war with Iran, right? And
right.
It's almost like their moves are becoming less sneaky, and they're just sort of trying to replay the old hits of the past without as much success.
Yeah, it's like watching, an 80-year-old Mick Jagger run around singing, 19th Nervous Breakdown with the same energy that he sang it when he was in his 20s. And like, it doesn't work nearly as well. I mean, which is one of the few Stone songs, by the way. It's the only one that came to mind because it's one of the few that I actually really like. And and it's just, and it's that thing. It doesn't matter if we're talking about this. The Stones are the first thing that comes to mind because they're ageless. But it is I think that is where we are, and they have become very sloppy in their execution. So here we are on the day of the G7, and Trump came out this morning. I don't know if you saw the clip of him saying, well, it's the G7. It used to be the G8, and that was a real mistake throwing Russia out, because we wouldn't be in the position that we're in today, and we're not talking to them. There wouldn't be a war. And I don't know about you. It was really funny. I watched that clip, and I looked at Mark Carney's body language, and he wasn't standing straight up. Like everybody else was standing tall with their shoulders back and everything else. And Trump always looks that way. And Carney was like a little question mark. He was like it was a really weird body language that he had. His a sunken chest and head up, and then his knees. He literally looked like he was curling up into a ball. And I'm like, dude, you don't have any power here. And he was just like projecting that to the world. And yet, that he doesn't think he doesn't have any power, right? Because he's one of those guys.
He looked like he was a middle manager who knows he's about to get in trouble from the boss. And the announcements that Trump was making, it was very clear that Carney didn't want to be up there. He didn't want to seem like he was part of those announcements. And then, at the end of Trump speaking for a bit, he was like, well, I should take my privilege as chair of the G7 to move this right along. We'll have lots of time to talk about this later. Because, like Trump has basically gone right into the den of the lions, which is pretty much what the G7 is at this point, and is just looking them straight in the eyes and telling them you're not in charge anymore. So
right.
I think that's a very positive development in terms of him doing what he says he's going to do.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. The funny part about it is, what are they going to do? Kick Trump out of the G7? So this is the G6? Like, that's nice. Like, it kind of rhymes with MI6, but who cares? Like, at that point, like, it's like, so it's the, it's the geriatric six. It's the It's the unimportant six, to be honest with you. Unfortunately, there's no good word for that starts with G that I come up with off the top of my head to make a funny here. But maybe geriatric six is probably the best, and we'll just leave it at that. Yeah, because you know what they're going to do with the G7. They're going to try and browbeat Trump into coming off of his tariffs and all of this stuff. And I don't know about you, but I get the sense that Trump is just going in there with licking his lips, like I can't wait to take these guys to the woodshed. And it's funny this happening. What I mean by this, of course, is that Israel, Iran, popping off right now while the G7 is going on. Clearly, that was on everybody's Gantt chart. So maybe they're the Gantt chart 7. You know what I mean? They're the Gantt 7. And I don't know that that's going to. I mean, I really watching this going. I don't think that this is going to work the way you think it's going to work. And so it's I don't know. You give me your sense of what you think is going to happen if you can. I mean, this may be an unfair question. Like, what do you think is going to happen here, if anything?
It feels like it's just another tired attempt at what they were doing with the Ukraine, basically, right? They're saying like, bad man over here, ring the bell, come to our rescue. And they realized at some point that the Ukraine was not important enough to the United States to continue to rescue at massive cost with little to no benefit. And they're I think seeing that the cost benefit analysis on joining the war here just isn't really there. Like, I don't think anybody's worried that this is going to result in the end of the state of Israel, right? I think that's probably not an outcome that's on the table. Not even realistically regime change for Netanyahu, but the opposite is on the table, right? The regime change in Iran is for sure on the table, and so like worst case scenario, they kind of fight to a standstill, and then you end up in a world where neither side has as many weapons. They both need to buy more weapons. The Iranians are set back a number of years on their nuclear program, and we're right back where we were, basically. So there isn't really a huge benefit, I don't think, to the United States joining that war. And I think other than just, all of the strings that the state of Israel has throughout the government of the United States, there isn't a rational reason to do it. And I think so far it looks like Trump hopefully is holding up to that.
Yeah, I think so. I have a slightly different ultimate take on this, and I don't want to take a half an hour to lay it out. And I'm still I know everybody wants my opinion on this at this moment in time, and I'm in many ways kind of not giving it because I'm waiting to watch this way each layer of this keeps playing itself out. And I mean this sincerely. We don't have enough information at this point to know what's going to happen next. I'm going to tell everybody what I think I hope is the best outcome for humanity. And then you can figure it out. You can backfill from there by looking at the tea leaves and deciding whether or not the world operates under that potential rubric or not, which is that it's like watching Toronto and Philadelphia play a hockey game. I hope for a tie and a whole lot of injuries. I don't want either of them to get anything. I'm an old Giant fan. I used to say that about, when Philadelphia and Dallas were playing. I'm like, I hope for in football, a tie and a lot of injuries. It never happens, right? Because somebody usually wins. If for nothing else, because Vegas needs somebody to win. But I didn't say that out loud. So, or I guess I did. So that's what I see playing out here is we're going to find out, who's been bluffing, who's not bluffing, and who's trying for war and who wants war and who doesn't want war. The interesting part about all this is when we get into, I said we wouldn't talk about Israel around, but we're going to do it a little bit because it's actually a good metaphor for all of the other fights that are going on, including Alberta, including Bitcoin versus, we're going to get into Bitcoin in a little bit as well. This is all, I think, a metaphor that there's a Venn diagram here. The neocons and Davos, they want a war with Iran. Okay, well, Trump doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That is not a one-to-one overlap. So they can have a war with Iran. Trump wants peace in the Middle East, and war with Iran or regime change in Iran or no nuclear weapons in Iran is the overlap in the Venn diagram. They're using it for different purpose. They're using that overlap for their own specific purposes, and that's what I think is playing out here. Well, now let's talk about this in terms of why is Mark Carney, trying to turn Canada into an offshore weapons platform or a north of the border weapons platform to point at the United States. It's the same thing. All of this is pointed at, in my mind, is still pointed at the United States in order to create a potential civil war scenario here. And Canada is just part of that. And I think that's actually what everybody's going to be virtue signaling at the G7, rightly or wrongly. That's where I think we are. So, and I think all of these conflicts, hinge on that same basic framework, which is that they can't have their cookie if the United States stands. Like if the United States survives this.
Yeah, it's really at the 50,000 foot view. It's really about Trump taking on Davos, right? Just about everything else in the world right now
Right.
is that power struggle where it had been a scenario where it was kind of like the United States to me seemed like a Weekend at Bernie's situation where the various powers that be around the world had been flopping around the corpse of a former great nation, and now Trump coming into power is the first time in a long time that an American's held the strings. So
Right.
it's that power struggle at the end of the day that really is going to determine what everyone is doing, and the you really need to look no further than to look at the fact that the European leaders very obviously want this conflict.
Yes.
Like they have no rational vested interest in either this conflict or the conflict in Ukraine continuing. But the very fact that they're trying to perpetuate both of those shows you that they're at odds with the current goal of American isolationism, you could call it. I guess they're trying to draw the United States out into the rest of the world again.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, I still see it that way, and I don't think I'm being played by Donald Trump here. I think that Trump is very serious that he wants some form of peace in the Middle East. He's put that whole framework together, and then when you push it to the point that he's pushed it, and he's got buy-in from the Saudis, and got buy-in from Qatar and UAE, and to a lesser extent the Russians, who are clearly making deals, for what they want. And then you realize ultimately that it's going to provoke the ultimate response from Davos, which is that they're going to try and go for the big kahuna, which is World War III. So now the bigger question, I guess, is, or the next question in this is, when where does this fit into the ultimate framework of, how does, I know, because I want to shift this into Bitcoin. I'm just trying to look for the best way to make that shift, not pudgy. And I guess I'm failing here, because I do see that Bitcoin and what the things that Trump is doing domestically are playing into this as well. So I don't know. I'll let you chew on that, because I know you have a lot of ideas in your head about what Bitcoin is capable of, and I know you and I talked about a lot about my framework on it, yours, and I think there's a lot to discuss. There's some meat we can put on those bones, especially in light of some of the conversations that I've had on this podcast with other people like Caitlin Long and Vince and some others. So I know I'm going to leave it there. We'll see what we can come up with.
Yeah. So first, I think it's important to sort of recognize what's going on right now. And at the end of the day, there's really a fundamental shift in the way that financial markets work is ongoing right now. And we've got this shift of power over from the Bank of England moving to the United States. At the same time, the nature of debt, I think, is changing quite significantly. The nature of what sovereign debt means is changing. And markets have operated with this concept for a long time of this sort of like risk-adjusted reward, which has as an assumption at the base of that concept that the United States T-bills are sort of like the lowest risk thing that you can possibly invest in. This is something that will offer you a guaranteed return with as near to zero risk of default as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're now in a world where one has to basically look at the possibility that some level of default on UST bills is really not off the table, especially with this sort of global trade war that I don't know if you want to call it a global trade war, a global trade stick poking, sort of poking the bears around the world with tariffs and trying to renegotiate the terms of global trade. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that the United States will start, either not fully honoring T bills or having differently priced T bills for different parts of the world, or T bills that are not optional to purchase in some parts of the world, for example. We're starting to see really a change in what debt means, and that means that we have now the need for sort of an entirely new form of collateral.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this goes back to some of what you've talked about with Bitcoin and with gold, of course, as well, where the natural way for a country to maintain the competitiveness of their currency nowadays, and in moving away from potentially backing a lot of their currency with dollars, with T bills, is to back it with hard assets, essentially, right? And as we move to gold and Bitcoin, which I believe is the hardest asset of all time, that I think is the change that we're going through right now when it comes to Bitcoin. Is we're just moving through the phase where the markets and soon governments are starting to see it as really the most pristine form of collateral that can be found out there, and that's sort of the next big stage that I anticipate for Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, that's I agree with you, and I was at the Bitcoin Bay uh, conference over the weekend. And I spoke there at a couple of panels, and that was what I was trying to impress upon them, which is that this is ultimately what Bitcoin represents. It does represent a form of pristine collateral. You and I can argue, and I may make the argument. I'm not completely convinced that Bitcoin is the most pristine form of collateral, but I'm happy to be wrong about that. Like at this point in time, the market is going to decide what that is. At this moment in time, when you look at the way the world is operating, it's clear that the central banks who have problems, who all have problems with sovereign debt, ultimately, are going to, they're moving to gold. Like last year, the number was like 28% of the world gold demand was central banks. That is up from 15% just 3 years ago. So now it's a significant amount of money. When you look at it from that perspective, all of a sudden you have to really come to the conclusion that that process is accelerating. So central banks at this point still trust gold more than they trust Bitcoin, and for that reason, okay, well that's where we are. Then that's what we have to accept that, whether we like it or not. If you're a Bitcoiner, you can say, it doesn't matter. Like, well, yeah, it does matter. What the market cares about, what the market values at this moment in time, is what the market is going to gravitate towards. That perception may change in 10 years. Like, talk to me in 5-10 years, and that we may be having this conversation going, up, Dave, you were right the entire time. And I'll be like, yep, all right, cool. And we'll move on. What is important though is now you can see the rush coming in the American sphere, that they believe Bitcoin is pristine collateral, and it's the best way for them at this point to collateralize the U.S. Treasury market, because they're making those moves. And the stablecoin, the Genius Bill, is part of that. I've talked about this before. So I think it's very clear that that's where we are in this process. So does that convey to the United States a first mover advantage in effect? I think so. And I think what we've seen previously, you and I both have seen this, which is that note who's the most hostile to Bitcoin of all the major financial players. We know where they are. They're in Europe. They're still screaming about how Bitcoin is evil and yada yada and all of this stuff. So, when you're in that, that's kind of the way, and that's the overlay. It's like why I brought up Israel and Iran, and why I was trying to tie it to Bitcoin, is the fact that the war takes place. The same war is being fought in different contexts, but over different, you know, assets, but it's all the same war.
Yeah, absolutely. And the really the last century of dominance from Davos has rested on their ability to print money to spend money and
Mm-hmm.
their control of all the central banks in the world for the most part. And they're just starting to see that control slipping away, and they're really just sort of feudally grasping at the last pieces of power that are left. And yeah, like you said, they're moving to gold, they're moving to Bitcoin, and I think it's there's an interesting scenario that could play out here that may demonstrate some of the strengths and weaknesses of gold and Bitcoin as this form of collateral.
Mm-hmm.
And the what is obviously I think going on first is that you have the fact that gold has this multi-thousand-year history of being the best form of money that the whole world has used,
Mm-hmm.
and being the hardest form of money. And so naturally the sort of incumbent players are switching to what they know best, right? They're switching
Mm-hmm.
to the hardest form of money that they've used for the history of their existence.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we're starting to see the actual markets, the private markets, the public markets are starting to react to Bitcoin as collateral in that same sense. And we've seen the
Mm-hmm.
sort of the Bitcoin treasury company, the play that's going on right now, where companies are actually getting a massive multiple on top of the value of their Bitcoin because the market's essentially, I would say, overvaluing its effectiveness as a form of collateral at this point. So as always, the private sector is a little bit ahead of the public sector, and so they're starting to see that sooner. But one thing that I could see playing out is, you've got this rush into gold right now. All these central banks, I don't anticipate it's going to be lower this year than it was last year. I think it's going to increase.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the way that gold actually moves around the world,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't move very quickly, right?
No.
You want to physically move gold around the world, and so the reality is that a lot of what these central banks have on their balance sheet is not gold. It's IOUs for gold held by the Federal Reserve or some other entity out there that is
Right.
custodying their gold for them. And in a world where T-bills, may change the rate at which they're honored, in a world where they're no longer um, sort of the full faith and confidence of the United States government loses some of its value, at least on the international stage, that sort of like, trust me, bro, I've got the gold, may
Mm-hmm.
not suffice, right? And we may see, especially if we see, as we no doubt will, further global turmoil brought on by the warmongering City of London, Davos types. We may see countries that want their gold back that
Mm-hmm.
physically cannot get their gold back either fast
Mm-hmm.
enough or cannot get their gold out of an area that uh, becomes no longer safe to store their gold at some point. And so those kind of problems illustrate really where Bitcoin comes in as a form of collateral that, because it's much more portable,
Mm-hmm.
really becomes a lot more liquid in the large scale of things. And so I think like I think that's where we're going to shift. I think your prediction of maybe in 10 years we'll say Bitcoin was the best form of collateral. I think we will be at that point by then. I think Bitcoin will probably vastly have eclipsed the market cap of gold, and will probably be a big part of sort of like the overnight lending
Mm-hmm.
um, situation in the entire world. Is if you've got these sort of collateralized or partially collateralized loans flying around, it really changes the nature and the risk profile of basically everything from the top to the bottom of the market.
Right. Well, I am going to, the one thing I am going to say, because you've mentioned it now twice, I'm going to push back on you a little bit here because um, part of, and it's about the treasury market, and it's not because I'm, such a USA homer or anything like that. The idea that the U.S. Treasury market is not a risk. It is, I think, just let me clarify. What you were saying, let me make sure that I'm not putting words in your mouth, which is that the U.S. Treasury market is no longer considered the pristine collateral of the world. Is that what you were saying previously?
I would say that I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to put it completely like that. I would say that the market is starting to realize that it might not be.
Okay, that's fair. Um, and what you're seeing from the United States, and I think you're seeing from other central banks, is that the United States is going to fight very hard to collateralize the T-bill market or the entire U.S. Treasury market with with a higher percentage of pristine collateral, which is the same argument I've been making for a long time. I've said for a long time that I don't think the Fed is fighting a rising gold price. You hold, if you're holding it on your books at $11 billion, which is what we hold the Fed's. That's the Fed's. That's what the Fed holds it on its balance sheet. Even though we know it's worth close to $800 billion, the U.S. gold reserves, it's still only 10% of, or 15% of the Fed's balance sheet, 13% of the Fed's balance sheet. At $6,000, it's now 25% of the Fed's balance sheet. If Jerome Powell never sells another, mortgage-backed security or U.S. Treasury, doesn't shrink that balance sheet by $1 here forward, and the gold doubles in price, and it's going to be 28% of the balance sheet. Now the Fed is only 4-to-1 leverage, or 3.5 to 1 leverage versus hard assets, versus 30-to-1, which is where they were. You know what I mean? So this is that if you're looking at the Treasury market from that perspective, then I'll agree with you. But if you're saying that in some way that the market is worried that the U.S. can't pay its bills, that's not true. The Treasury has the ability to just print dollars. I mean,
Yeah,
in that
I'm not necessarily. I wouldn't be worried about the idea that the U.S. can't print its bills. I'd be more worried if I was a foreign creditor about the idea that the U.S. might say we're not going to print to pay off these bills. Especially as this sort of global economic warfare continues. The idea that they might say we're not honoring T-bills from a certain country at full value seems less and less crazy to me, and that's not at all far off from the tariff approach. And so I could absolutely see something like that. And I think what you're describing, it's pretty much in line with what I was describing, because I think what you're going to have is both the U.S. shoring up its own collateral stack with hard assets to back the T-bills, but those same hard assets will start to creep into the collateral stacks of central banks and displace to some extent the T-bills that they've been using as their sort of like their sort of like backdrop for everything. And it's kind of like a slow creep at that point. It becomes a bit of a race of who can acquire more gold, more Bitcoin sooner. And the saying we always have in Bitcoin is gradually, then suddenly. It's probably likely to be a very slow race until all of a sudden it's a very fast race to acquire those assets.
Yes, and markets are slow to move on the perception that something is fundamentally changed, because they don't want to, and because they don't need to, because of the way the money moves around the world, and the contracts that people have, and the prospectuses that the funds have, and the rules around pension funds and insurance funds and everything else. There are other aspects of the American plans, I think, for recapitalization of the country that I know Trump has. I don't need to get into that stuff because that's not why I have you on the podcast. That's why I go on someone else's podcast to talk about it. So, and I'll talk about them there. So, when we think about it, but just to clarify for the listener, we're not saying this is the death of the dollar. We're not saying this is the death of the T-bill market. We're saying is that the nature of how these things are being valued by the market is changing. It's no longer, in effect, and I'm going to state it. I'm going to see if you agree with me on this. It's no longer going to be, because I think you touched on it, that we're looking at the full faith and credit, which is effectively we're going to tax our people against their labor in order to pay for the interest on the T-bills. That's one model. The other model is we're going to tax the rest of the world for access to our markets, and then we're going to, in any debt that we continue to have, we have on our books, is going to be paid for out of the cash flow of the society, and mostly, hopefully, through tariffs and or investment returns that people are incentivized to want to hold T-bills because they represent a good form. They represent a properly risk weighted form of savings and return on our savings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to sort of flip it around, an interesting way to look at this for the Bitcoiners is that Bitcoin has always been a competitor to the dollar and remains a competitor to the dollar at the end of the day. Sure. But there's been a major shift now in that the dollar is actually starting to compete. Is kind of the way that I would look at it, right? The
Mhm.
previous to the current changes, the dollar has not been a good competitor to Bitcoin whatsoever. And really, if they never would have gone off the gold standard, there would have been really no need for Bitcoin, right? It wouldn't have it wouldn't have been able to fill this massive gap in the world. And so I
Sure.
think the dollar being the strongest currency in the world is definitely best positioned in the long term to compete with Bitcoin. And this change of direction to recapitalizing really probably gives even in the eyes of the most staunch Bitcoin maximalist, which I am,
Hmm.
it gives the dollar a lot more lifespan. It gives it a longer term time frame through which it will be able to compete with Bitcoin, and really just it shifts the math. It's no longer as much of a melting ice cube.
Right. And this is all I've ever argued, which is all I've ever said is, and I've said this to Bitcoiners before, and I've said it to you before, and I said it this weekend at the conference, which is that you have to imagine Bitcoiners a world and do a SWOT analysis, an SWOT analysis on Bitcoin, and say, okay, well, what's the threat to Bitcoin? And if you say there aren't any, I say that's nice. You're not doing the full analysis. It's no different than gold bugs who say just buy gold. There's no threat to gold. There is a threat to gold, which is that what happens when the Federal Reserve decides to defend itself. Bitcoin was birthed as a reaction against the Federal Reserve under Bernanke, and then Yellen going full globalist and going effectively full MMT for all intents and purposes, being at the zero bound for 12 years and monetizing all the debt and all this rotten nonsense. Now the Fed's not doing that. Now the Fed has tools that it's using. And now I think in conjunction with Scott Bessent at Treasury to defend the dollar and what the dollar is capable of. And if that means, having to, recapitalize, well, okay, we're going to recapitalize. We're going to defend ourselves. If Bitcoin still wins that war, bonsai. That's all I've ever said. Bonsai. Okay, cool. But don't ever think that, the empire is not going to strike back. Like, it's not hard. Now the question is which empire? And do you want the Davosian, vampires with their digital euro and their CBDC and their 100% tax compliance on the fly, and they want to treat the entire world the way New Jersey treats homeowners, where they follow people home from Home Depot where they bought some paint to paint their porch and then immediately reassess their their tax bill, which they do, their property tax, which they do in the state of New Jersey. They're literally guys would sit and follow people home from Home Depot and then reassess their taxes on the fly because they were doing home improvements, right? Well, it's the same thing here. Like at some point, you have to ask yourself. That's what the Europeans want. They want the ability to be able to cut you out from any kind of financial system. Mark Carney wants this in Canada. You guys are, Justin Trudeau already tried this once, and again, another one of those moments where Canadians finally, they pushed a certain group of Canadians over the line towards saying this is not the system we want. Um, and you have your choice. You may have to accept, an interim, situation where the U.S. Treasury market is more widespread and more democratized than it's ever been. It's not in the hands of the central banks, but it's in the hands of people tokenized on the Tether blockchain or the Ripple blockchain, or even, in some other way that then trades against Bitcoin or even trades against tokenized gold or anything else. Like that's a model that's coming. It's happening right now, and you can't argue it. I was speaking to somebody over the weekend. I met with one of my subscribers came up, and they had just come back from Peru. And they're like, we were all through Central and South America, and there were people and there are places down there where where prices are denominated in tether, like apples. You buy them in
Yeah,
tether, right? Like it's happening. And tether's backed by T-bills and a little bit of Bitcoin and a little bit of gold and a little bit of long-term treasuries and a little bit of U.S. corporate paper. That's tether's balance sheet. You can argue that until your cows come home that it's not true, but it is. Market thinks it's true. So now what?
yeah, exactly. So the interesting thing you pointed out there, I
Mm,
don't think the Europeans and their path is well suited at all to compete with Bitcoin. I don't think that's a threat to the price or the market dominance of Bitcoin whatsoever. Their path is more like, let's continue down this modern monetary theory path. We're going to continue to just print and spend forever, basically, is the mantra. And we're going to print enough money that we can then spend on enforcement measures and red tape that will make it hard for people to operate Bitcoin businesses. It will make it hard for individuals to hold Bitcoin or get access to the price of Bitcoin through financial products. And that method has no chance of succeeding. Bitcoin is money, and money is generally the most saleable good, right? And no government in the history of the world has really ever been able to successfully ban anything, right? Like how did banning cocaine go? And it's a whole lot easier to move Bitcoin than it is to move cocaine. And so really governments banning, going after, cracking down on Bitcoin with the sort of iron fist and trying to suck all of that market pressure into their own CBDC controlled currencies and all this stuff. Like, that's not, to me, a serious threat to Bitcoin. And I don't view what's going on with the US dollar as a threat to Bitcoin, but it's competition
Sure.
nonetheless, right? It's
Yeah.
that's the way to protect your currency from really being swallowed up by Bitcoin, is you now have to compete with it. You now have to live in a world where this permanently scarce asset is on the market and can be something that people choose as their form of money.
Hmm.
And right now, the US dollar, I think, is actually set up to really gain a lot more dominance than it probably ever has with these things that, I haven't even heard Peru before, but I've heard other places in South America with these tether pricing numbers. And
Hmm.
the number that I heard, which is now probably about 6 months old, was that Tether had 400 million users.
Yeah, that's
Like
what
that.
Caitlin Long said to me about a month and a half ago.
Yeah,
I'm going to go with it. Yeah,
that's I bet you it's a lot more than that by now. I wouldn't
I
be surprised if it's doubled with all of the massive amount of money that they've been putting into spreading Tether throughout the developed world. And really, it's the same concept that we as Bitcoiners think will eventually happen to the US dollar, is that good money pushes out bad money. Right now, you've got a much better form of money in the United States dollar. Now they actually have a really easy way to use it. Of course, it's going to push out their lesser currencies. And really, the end result is that a lot more governments in the world, a lot more of the smaller currencies in the world will probably fail. And
hmm
those governments will lose their ability to print money, to spend money, which hopefully is a good thing in the long term.
I agree. No, I absolutely agree, and I think you're correct in that. Um, Gresham's law is usually stated, which is what you just alluded to, that good money pushes out bad. It's better to get the actual text of Gresham's law, which is that overvalued money is circulates and undervalued money is saved, is stored. And so, in a sense, and then eventually, and with the case you just put forth, versus the Peruvian peso or whatever, that it would be ignored. The really uninteresting money would be ignored, or the currency would be ignored. And people, it's funny. There was a panel this weekend of people living on Bitcoin. There's all these people that are out there living on, and they're giving you their stories about how they live their entire life on Bitcoin, which is great and it's fun and everything else. And at the end, the moderator asked them all, okay, so what if there's one thing you could tell people what to do with their Bitcoin? How to live. What can you tell them about living with Bitcoin? What would it be? And the last guy ended it with, spend your fiat, save your Bitcoin. And I'm like, wow, is this 2014 or what? Like, it's like, it hasn't changed since, it's in the same, and nothing's changed. I don't think Bitcoin is, I think you're correct. I don't think Bitcoin has reached its full capitalization. I don't think that the dollar can, what we're describing here, I think, is that the dollar being more widely spread as a unit of account and as necessarily a quote unquote medium of exchange, or at least really as the unit of account, but all the collateral underneath it has changed and is different. That's really what people are trading. And the dollar pricing is just the measurement stick. And the dollar can lose. This is what a lot of people don't get. The dollar can lose its store value perception aspect of money and move and go and retain its medium of exchange and unit of account aspects, and that's fine because it doesn't have any other uses other than that. And that's the shift that's happening underneath. That's when I talk about collateral, when Alex Craner talks about it, when Dave talked about it today, is that It's that's what's changing is what undergirds the dollar, what collateralizes all of this. That can change. And a lot of people believe that once the dollar loses its reserve currency status, the dollar is done. Sorry, but that's a whole lot of City of London propaganda. I've come to that conclusion that's just propaganda. And I don't know if we're going to tokenize enough gold to make that part of the collateral process, or if it's all going to be Bitcoin or whatever. But it doesn't matter. The market will choose that over time. And what matters is that we have a smooth transition from one system to the other. So that
Yeah,
civilization
absolutely.
is not lost in the process is ultimately the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to be interesting going down the road too to see, like, my guess would be that you get another Republican president after Trump,
Mm-hmm.
um, which but that's a long ways down the road, right?
Sure.
And so what we know is happening now for sure is this process that you're describing of moving to a more collateralized USD and moving to Tether and potentially USDC. I think it's going to be Tether outside the US, USDC within the US that
Mm-hmm.
they're essentially backing. And
Mm-hmm.
we're right now going through the process where all the infrastructure is being set up to drive this medium of exchange forward. Right
Mm-hmm.
now, the detail that's important with Tether, and especially if we don't end up with a Republican president 3 years from now, we
Mm-hmm.
end up with the AOC presidency and the that would mean that the city of London had won a big battle essentially, right? If they got another presidency in there, and it'd be very very bad for Americans, but something that could become an issue in a world where Tether is ubiquitous is the fact that Tether is really just a database, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a database held by one company that can effectively control all the balances on that database, just like your bank balances or any other centrally controlled balance like that. And something that we've seen in Canada here that has sort of driven that other side of Bitcoin adoption that like spend save your Bitcoin, spend your dollars, but there's this underground or sort of like grassroots movement to really push the other elements of Bitcoin and that spending economy that is really just sort of getting off the ground. And we have a really cool version here in Calgary, set up by my good friend Ben, BTC Sessions, that we had a cigar with while you're in town here.
Yep.
And it's this movement called the Sat Market, and it's basically like a flea market, farmers market type setup that we do a few times a year where everybody takes Bitcoin. And this came from the idea that Ben and I were talking about of essentially worrying that, this is a couple of years ago we started talking about this. Um, what are the chances that the government starts to say you can't eat so much red meat, right?
Right.
And if you eat so much red meat, then you don't have enough carbon credits to drive next week or something else like that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
um, really, we wanted a way to be able to ensure that we could buy the things that we want and need, like beef,
Right.
without the government's help or permission. And so
Absolutely.
that's sort of the other angle of Bitcoin that I think is really just starting to take hold is the fact that on top of being a pristine form of collateral, and on top of being really newly brought into the world's collateral markets, Bitcoin can be this censorship resistant tool that allows everybody from dissidents like Ben mentioned at the Cornerstone forum there. There's dissidents using Bitcoin to cross borders and hide money from hostile regimes and that kind of thing. Um, so I think we're going to see the development of both in the
Yeah.
next 4 or 5 years to a decade, and it like I couldn't even make a guess at which of those things is going to be more important, but it kind of depends on how much the governments decide to crack down on the users of the dollar using
Mm-hmm.
the digital technology of the dollar.
Right. Yeah, no, that's it's a very good point, and it's something we want to just keep an eye on. And ultimately, what I say in this is, I hope that it all happens. Right? You want all of those infrastructure bits in place. When I was one of the things that popped into my head while I was listening to that forum was, when you stop to look at where things are for interfacing with the dollar world as of right now, no matter what you do with Bitcoin, if you have to pay in dollars and you're not paying it directly in Bitcoin, right? You're not moving from, your address to, moving UTXO from this address to that address, right? Then you're having to pay some third parties in between. You're having to like go from here to that guy, then from that guy to that guy to then get to then pay your pay your electric bill. Well, that doesn't look a whole lot different than the current system we have right now. The thing I want to get rid of are the toll booth operators in the way, because that's Davos's power. Davos's power has always been, or City of London or whomever, and it's centered around City of London. That real power. That's why they wouldn't. That's why they never wanted to give up Brexit. Wanted to go for a real Brexit. Is that forex? It's the currency arbitrage. It's the from Bitcoin to dollars is a forex exchange, and they want the toll booths because they and the British pound still settles way too much of the world's forex because of the infrastructure that it has around the world to convert Chilean pesos into Turkish lira or whatever. That's the thing that has to go away. The Thomas Cooks of the world have to go. They don't get to make 8% because I landed in Mexico and want to spend and need some Mexican pesos, and they get to charge me 8% to convert my dollars. Fuck you. That's not the way this works. Like, that's the world we have to disintermediate. And I don't want to see Bitcoiners advocating for a new version of that system, right? If we're going to move to Bitcoin in some way, manner, shape, or form, it has to be one that bypasses them, disintermediates them, even if I have to use somebody else as in the interim. And I'm going to piss a lot of people off because I like to do this. And we go with Ripple, which is a better Forex platform, for example, than anything else that we have right now to replace those people. Like, I don't care that Ripple's not it doesn't have to be a long-term solution. I don't even know that it's a good solution in the long term, but in the medium term, depending on who's controlling it, if it's on our side of the fence, and then we're disintermediating, that's another way to take away one of their pillars of power, one of their toll booths, which then gives them the ability to then, buy governments and buy corporate access and buy this and buy that. And that's what we have to take away from them. And that's the real promise of Bitcoin. That's the real promise of any kind of tokenized system. And of course, we were seeing the bad guys all trying to get as many quote unquote Bitcoins as they can in order to have control over that, which is the last thing. Now, the last thing I'm going to bring up to you, and I want you to talk about it, which is notice how the BlackRocks of the world are attempting to make a bid for 51% of the Bitcoin supply that's out there. If you haven't, if you can't see what's going on, folks, that's clearly what's out there. That's clearly what the strategy is right now. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So you look at, as we mentioned, this corporate Bitcoin mania that's going on right now with all these Bitcoin treasury companies popping up.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that basically all of those treasury companies have in common is that those Bitcoin are held in the state of New York under the custody of either Coinbase or Fidelity. Mm-hmm. And so, I was listening to a guy that I really started to appreciate since you had him on month or two ago, Ian Burlingame,
mm-hmm.
and he was talking about the Praetorians, which is a very interesting topic that I recommend everybody go down that rabbit hole.
I agree.
And one of the quotes that he had was like, for a billionaire, who owns your house? Is it you or your head of security? Right? And at the end of the day, the man with the gun has the control, right? And so, if you're investing in these, and whether it's an individual or BlackRock, and you're investing in these equities that have Bitcoin on the balance sheet with the goal of getting exposure to the price of Bitcoin, which I think is a lot of what we're seeing right now. Mm-hmm. You have to be aware that at the end of the day, those Bitcoin are effectively in the control of whoever's controlling the United States government. Right. And so in a world where we swing back to a Davos controlled United States government, the idea that they might go, and right now I think it's sitting 4 million Bitcoin, something like that, sitting in that custody. The idea that they might just take that Bitcoin and say, we're now putting this in our collateral stack, and you're now unsecured creditors of the United States government, is not at all far-fetched. No. And so I think that's something pretty interesting to consider, as well as and that may be the case also for sovereign nations that start to to hold their own Bitcoin? Where are they going to be storing that Bitcoin? You get right back into a trust situation, which
Right.
is essentially what we're hoping to avoid with, the idea of moving away from T-bills as the risk adjusted
Right. The
baseline asset.
right. Well, in a sense, if you watch these people operate, they're always trying to replicate their previously successful business model. So
Yeah.
the previously successful business model was, well, store all your sovereign gold at the Bank of England. Oh, well, World War II, move it all over to the Federal Reserve, which we also control. Okay. Well, what are they doing with Bitcoin? What you just described is that everybody will hold your gold for you because it's safe and we'll take care of it. We're all allies and we're all friends here. Right.
Yeah.
Same thing. And we don't want to see that happen with Bitcoin. We don't even really want to see that with gold. This is why everybody's asking for their gold back, and because at the end of the day, I've made this point many times to people that possession is 9/10 of the law, and that's nice, Germany. You're going to do what we tell you to do because we control your gold, and we don't have to give it back to you. And that definition of doing what we tell you can change depending on, as you pointed out, the administration in power. The administration in power when it was Obama, it was do what we want you to do in terms of NATO, and fucking with Russia and fucking in the Middle East. And now it's under Trump's control, and Trump is saying, stop that same process. And so you can see this. You can see how that's a real issue. And this again gets back to a core argument of many Bitcoiners that let's get rid of the trust. You don't have to trust anybody, ultimately, or you control the gun. You control the guy with the gun, right? So just watch for that. They're always trying to replicate that previously successful business model to maintain their ability to then charge a toll booth, charge unearned wealth, charge an unearned thing fee because, well, we put ourselves in the middle of it. And then that's how they actually control everything else, because it's the middleman ultimately in the end that can really decide what's going to happen.
And like with many other things, they've really kind of lost the plot on the idea of a middleman, because good middlemen should add value, right? They should add efficiency and be useful. But there are just so many middlemen in the current financial system that are really, you really can't get away from them, right? If you want to send Philippines pesos from Canada to the Philippines, there's no way to do that, right? You have to go through intermediaries.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go through the Bank of London. You have to go through, there's going to be about 14 intermediaries, and all of those are international banks that are all taking a cut by the time you send that money there. And you can actually see in the Europeans' their tactics now with regards to Bitcoin, the same attempt to do this, right? They're imposing regulations that make it more and more difficult for Bitcoin businesses that do that forex trade, Bitcoin to fiat. They're making it more and more difficult for them to operate in Europe, so that only larger and larger businesses that they can more easily capture will be able to do that. And they're also trying to affect regulation to make it much more difficult for people, individuals or businesses, to hold their own Bitcoin.
Right.
So that by that same track, if you want to buy some Bitcoin, they're trying to make it illegal to transfer it to your self-custody and make it so that it has to go into a custodial account somewhere, which at the end of the day is that same level of trust that they can always take those coins if they decide they need to spend them at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, this is why what we've seen so far is, and you'll note, like under Biden, under Obama, and under Trump 1.0, because Congress was a fully captured creature at that point, that there was no regulatory certainty coming out of the United States on this very issue, and that is now changing rapidly. And you can thank, and as much as everybody wants to piss and moan about Peter Thiel and Palantir and this and that and everything else. Oh, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Like, dudes, the one thing they are doing is trying to that's moving in the right direction. That does not matter at that point. And I'm not saying it's not a problem. It's just that same faction that helped Trump get into power is actually working very hard to make regulatory certainty occur in the United States in such a way that we do have the ability to self-custody, to do that. And that's not quote unquote illegal. But Elizabeth Warren and Gary Gensler worked overtime the entire time to stop that from happening. And and it was we have to, at the very least go, look, it's changing. It's changing for the better. It may not be perfect, but it's moving in the right direction. And that's a good thing. And it's, I see the same thing in geopolitics. I see the same thing in capital markets across the board. There's still a very strong move towards private markets need to exist, whereas Europe is pushing very hard to do away with all private markets completely. So,
yeah, and I think an interesting way to look at it for Bitcoiners right now is that a bet on Bitcoin is a bet on the American Trump camp at the moment versus the Davos camp.
I think that's a good way to end it, and I think it's also a metaphor for everything else that's going on. So, Dave Bradley, thank you. Where can people find you? Yada yada yada, all of that stuff. Let's do the
thing. I have to shill my own event that's coming up. It's a little under 2 weeks. We've got here the Bitcoin Rodeo is a Bitcoin conference we put on here in Calgary. We're going to be talking a lot about Alberta independence this time. It's June 28th and 29th at the Grand Theatre here in Calgary, and it's a completely non-technical conference. We're going to be talking more about similar conversations to what we're having here of like, where does Bitcoin fit into the real world? And we've been talking at sort of like the 50,000-foot view of macroeconomics. Where does it fit in? We're going to be talking about that, but also where does it fit in at the ground level for the average person, and what does that mean? So anybody who is a freedom-minded person who has identified that the problem of government overreach and government overspending is really what we're facing as the main boogeyman of our times. We believe Bitcoin's the solution to that, and come on out to check out the show. It's like I said, June 28th and 29th. Tickets are on bitcoinrodeo.com. And you can find me as Bitcoin Brains on virtually every platform. And I have my own mini little show on X that I put out whenever I feel like it, called the Bitcoin Hour, where I rant and smoke a cigar. And I felt like the world needed more of me ranting. So
very good. I'll make sure that there's a link to the rodeo in the show notes on this, and we'll go from there. So as always, I'm TFL1728 on Twitter, pissing everybody off on a daily basis. Patreon/Gold Goats and Guns. You guys know the drill. You guys be well. You talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.